Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hi, this is Dr. Cynthia Toolin-Wilson, and my show is Author to Author. Tonight I'm interviewing Heather Erb, and she wrote a book called The Path of Spiritual Happiness, which is well worth reading. Heather, welcome.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
So this is quite an interesting book. When you see the word spiritual and then you see all the philosophy, it's kind of a surprise for the novice, I'm sure, but it's quite interesting. Would you like to open us with a prayer, and then we can start going through the book?
That would be wonderful.
Okay.
I have a lot of inspiration through Thomas Aquinas, obviously, and St. John of the Cross, various followers of St. Thomas. And I thought I would introduce something here, just a couple of lines by St. John of the Cross, and then a very short prayer by him. And, there's so many mystics. He's, of course, the king of all the mystics, other than Thomas in my mind, but there's a new one, Blessed Concepcion de Armida, who wrote on Priests of Christ, the prayer in the Eucharist, which is interesting as well. But I've chosen, at any rate, St. John of the Cross. So he says his spiritual axioms, mine are the heavens and mine is the earth. Mine are the nations, the just are mine and mine the sinners. The angels are mine and the Mother of God. All things are mine. And God himself is mine, and for me because Christ is mine, and all for me. What do you ask then, and seek, my soul? Yours is all of this, and all is for you. Do not engage yourself in anything less, or pay heed to the crumbs that fall from your Father's table. Go forth and exult in your glory. Hide yourself in it and rejoice, and you will obtain the supplications of your heart. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, O blessed Jesus, give me stillness of soul in you. Let your mighty calmness reign in me. Rule me, O King of gentleness, King of peace. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Okay, so I'm turning it over to you so that you can tell us what you'd like to about your book and summarize it as you go through, or tell us why you wrote it. The microphone is yours.
Okay, and I really hope that you interrupt, because this is going to get pretty boring. I teach at a variety of types of places, and one of them at the Angelicum Academy is completely Socratic. So I really cannot hog the mic for too long. But and I'm often used to teaching by way of questions, so I won't ask too many questions here. I'll raise some of the questions that I started with when I wrote the book. And of course, this idea of the path of spiritual happiness, the very title, is something so practical. You mentioned that it's very lofty and so forth, and what does it have to do with philosophy? But the human being, for the Thomist tradition, is essentially an embodied spirit. And everybody, every young person that I teach and who I've dealt with through my teaching career in various places, whether it's secular or religious, I teach at a public university, a homeschooling academy. This is a common theme, the notion of the search for happiness in people, young people in particular, looking for a way and a path. So it's firstly put to them and my students who have taught me so much that philosophy, isn't just about knowing all the answers, but raising the right questions and learning how to formulate that longing for truth and goodness in a rational way. So it's really for them. And then secondarily, it is really for the seminaries and the priests, the religious who really are in need of simple handbooks in Christian philosophy. We've lost a lot of the Christian mysticism and the Christian philosophy even more so. So this one is for them. And so as far as the practical reasons for writing this, Cynthia, you can see there's a glossary at the back. There's very, very short, easy digestible chapters, study questions, and extra readings, the actual readings that are each chapter is based on at the end of each subsection. So there's three basic chapters. The first is on Aristotle's philosophical framework of happiness. The second big chapter is on Aquinas' development of Aristotle's theory in Christian beatitude. And then the third chapter is dealing with that great 20th century Thomist who really hasn't been spotlighted enough in my mind, Joseph Pieper, and of Pope John Paul the Great. But his work on contemplation, the philosophical act, and leisure, the basis of culture, and showing how he develops St. Thomas's theory, and I would say juxtaposes it to some errors in modern philosophy. So that is the third piece of this. Yeah, so those are the practical reasons I wrote it. There's a few theoretical reasons that I outline in the foreword. I have this wonderful Dominican, Father Kevin O'Reilly, who's now at the Angelicum in Rome, write that introduction, or the foreword rather, to this, and that's well worth reading. But there in the foreword and the preface and intro, I say, first of all, philosophy influences theology, and we need to retrieve a Christian philosophy of all sorts. This is the Christian philosophy of happiness in a very simple way, because philosophy illumines aspects of the faith, and of course, faith should lead philosophy to consider, appropriate topics. So, philosophy, as we know, is a fundamental part of evangelization. Another reason I wrote this is to offer, a critique of these counterfeits of happiness. So that's particularly in the Pieper section, where utilitarian hedonism and the kind of philosophy of anti-happiness you get with Immanuel Kant or Marx and so forth needs critique there. So this book is about spiritual values, and spiritual values which are required to preserve human dignity, values such as friendship, love, contemplation, and to build up culture, to retrieve and maintain culture. So very briefly, those are some of the reasons why I chose to write the book.
Okay. And actually, those are pretty deep reasons. I mean, that sounds like an enormous amount of material had to be read and sifted through, and worked with. So that explains the depth of the book very well.
Oh, thank you. Well, it could be seen as deep, and I'm glad you think so. I felt, looking back on it, that each chapter could have been 30 pages longer at the very least.
Of course,
It's not meant to be one of these huge scholarly tomes, that is laden with footnotes. I deliberately excised all footnotes, and I did give a gloss. This is a user-friendly book, so I want people, ordinary people, young people, parishioners, seminarians, to be able to pick the thing up and use it in a, as a guide to this, because this is really what many people are asking about. This is their deepest question, often. What is happiness and meaning? So while it's very basic, I think it deserved a fresh look for that audience.
Certainly, and with the culture that we live in today, where there's not an awful lot of study of philosophy, earlier philosophy anyway, or Christian philosophy, it makes sense that, for them to see this, for many it'll probably be the first time they see it. So it's important that it be brought to them.
Yes, and I would add too, Cynthia, that the church today has suffered a malaise of Christian philosophy. We have a number of scholars, in really good parts of the country and in Europe who are fine Catholic and Christian scholars of ethics and so on. But the popularization of this stuff, we have much more popular theology than we do Catholic philosophy. And that's understandable, really. There aren't that many Catholic philosophers out there. It's difficult to defend your turf in a secular environment as a Catholic philosopher, which I've done for years. And we're supposed to be in the world. We're called to be at our station, so to speak. And that's a wonderful thing, but that takes some philosophical know-how to do that.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, I think it'll be very good for young people in particular to read this.
Mm-hmm.
So would you like me to talk about any specific parts of it?
Well, I think a general overview would be very nice, because you do cover a lot of material, and I think that it would just be nice to orient people to that material, if you don't mind.
Sure, I would like that. And by the way, if we had another hour, which I don't have today, which neither of us have, it'd be wonderful to, author-to-author books, how would you rewrite the book a few years later? And
I like that.
Oh, yes. I would be adding so many texts from the great books, from everything from Plutarch to Dante to everything else, and interweaving these in a beautiful medley, because that's the way I teach. But there was page limit here and, priorities. So let's talk about the book. It goes chronologically, and it starts with Aristotle's philosophical framework for what he calls eudaimonia, which is happiness. Happiness not in the fleeting kind of modern psychological sense of feeling good or emotional states, which are transient, but a moral definition. Mortimer Adler made that distinction between the moral and the psychological senses of happiness. I might even say the metaphysical sense of happiness based on our human nature. And that is what Aristotle delivers. So in the first, I'll just say a couple of sentences about each part of this book, and then I'll go into a bit more detail in each one.
Okay.
So it's a really quick overview. Aristotle gives his philosophical framework. He asks, what is the good for human nature? This beautiful phrase, the good, underlying the word the. There's objective good. I always tell the students that it's not just what you feel or a subjective notion, but there is a good, a telos, or an end, a goal, inscribed in our very form. And so Aristotle asks, what is this? And he says, every action and activity aims at some kind of good, meaning some kind of fulfillment. But the problem is the identification of happiness and what it is. So Aristotle tracks the errors. I go through that a little bit. And then he gives us a very natural picture, totally transparent to human reason, without grace, and yet somehow fitting nicely into a Christian picture later with Aquinas. But he analyzes, and I walk through this. What are the errors regarding happiness? They are the traditional worldly goods, right? Pleasure, wealth, and honor. None of these, even taken as a group, are satisfactory because they don't correspond to our highest function. So I go through his function argument that happiness is an activity, it's an operation, it's something we do, and that it's really concerning the activation of our highest powers with respect to the highest objects that exist. So happiness isn't, sitting on the couch, watching the game, or let's clarify these days, the 8th rerun of the game. Happiness is in a sense the perfection of the soul primarily. But because Aristotle is different from Plato, he introduces a hylomorphism, that means a matter-form composite, as his definition of the human person. And so happiness is like a pie. It's a complex totality of bodily and external goods and spiritual goods, such as virtue. And this is what culminating in contemplation. So natural contemplation, philosophical contemplation of the causes of the universe, that is metaphysics. That's Aristotle. And I want to go into some of the issues with Aristotle in a minute. That's part A. Part B is Aquinas. And Aquinas develops Aristotle's theory. He baptizes. This is the great, phrase about Thomas Aquinas baptizing the Greeks. You've heard of medieval philosophers and Christians, quote, spoiling the Egyptians. That means taking what is good from these antecedent cultures and adapting them to Christian purposes. And this is what Aquinas does with Aristotle's theory. He joins biblical inspiration with Aristotle's realistic picture of the human person to construct really a bigger picture of what human life is and what it's capable of. And so he introduces the supernatural virtues, the theological virtues. The most important there is charity in the long run, so that happiness and not just an imitation of the gods or the motions of the planets from afar, but rather entering into the inner life of God through the God-man who comes into history. And this picture of happiness then is just a broadening and a deepening of what Aristotle gives us. In effect, Aristotle now becomes the model of imperfect earthly happiness. It's fine, but it's not the complete picture because of grace. So Aquinas deepens this, and all of this is because of God's initiative, something that was never possible in the Greek world. God condescending to enter into history, to reach down this divine invitation, and our lives and our ethical lives are the response to that. So we have this going on in Aquinas. Then the third part, Joseph Pieper comes along much later, of course, the 20th century, say in concert with, anticipating the work of John Paul the Great, Fides et Ratio. He reestablishes, if you will, not in contrast to Aquinas, but in contrast to modern philosophers, he reestablishes the dignity and the purpose and the nature of philosophy. And he also describes quite beautifully its connection to worship. Both of these are transcendent acts, he calls them, as opposed to utilitarian acts or acts based on leisure as entertainment. And they both are needed to renovate culture and give us our proper dignity. So he, like John Paul the Great, he celebrates the objectivity of reason against modern philosophies which have derailed themselves into trajectories of despair, really. Postmodernism, scientism, relativism, and their patrimony. And he traces all that through the errors, which I'll talk about in a moment, of Kant and Marx. So, the book is not the total picture of Christian philosophy. It's a partial, it's a slice of the development. So I could have focused on Plato, and I really could have focused more on Augustine, which I would love to if I redid this. But if we can talk about them maybe later, I will. But I would have really liked to include more on Augustine and his beautiful parable. He gives the parable of the lost coin and of the happy beggar and all of these amazing little stories in his Confessions. So he's a little less technical, right, Augustine? But I wanted to give the philosophical scaffolding, if you will, so that nothing would be missed conceptually, and that's what I've done here. So, so again, with that caveat that I haven't talked about some of the amazing Roman philosophers and Plato and his Gorgias and Cicero, and there's so much more that could be said. That caveat being said, a few words about Aristotle. I've divided each chapter into a number of sections. So Aristotle, we start out with the notion of Aristotle and philosophy, and then immediately launch into the basics of his system of happiness. And then at the end of that chapter, I discuss some problems with Aristotle, why he's not a completely adequate model for Christian philosophy. Do you have any specific questions, or should I just...
No, I'm interested in listening. You're making perfect sense to me.
Okay, all right, excellent. I'm glad. You're ahead of my students who don't always... right? But they make even less. Okay, so we have Aristotle and philosophy. I think the important thing here, I've said a number of things in that section. This is at the beginning of chapter 1. But that, I'm gearing it really towards what Aquinas was going to do with Aristotle. And Aquinas took Plato's emphasis on the immateriality of the soul and joined it to Aristotle's hylomorphism, the unity of body and soul. This is what the person is. And so we have a kind of balanced picture about what philosophy is about for Aristotle. It's not the kind of thing you see in the Stoics, which is a denial of desire and a denial of this worldly happiness. He's quite I wouldn't say a pragmatist, but he's a realist. And so he does accept the immateriality of the soul from Plato, and he does see happiness as ultimately and I say ultimately, detached from worldly goods to some extent. That is happiness in its highest pagan form. And we see that outlined in the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 10 at the end, where he argues for the superiority of contemplation over action. Thomas, by the way, picks that up nicely in the Summa. So in a sense, he's quite Platonic in his vision of happiness, but he's also recognizing the importance of the moral virtues. The thing that ties these Greeks together, and I think one of their main contributions and legacies, is that philosophy is consistently a way of life. And this is a corrective. Modern people's prejudices against philosophy as something abstract, system-building, detached, veering into ideology, and certainly it's earned that reputation, or just, trivial language games. That's what's happened over the past couple of hundred years. But these Greeks, as I think as Pierre Hadot would be the scholar to look there, philosophy is a way of life. If philosophy doesn't connect you to happiness, then it doesn't have much use. Then we move into various distinctions that are needed to understand what happiness is. The philosophical path is the path of definitions, and the way the Greeks get definitions is not just by throwing them at you, the way you might see in a manual somewhere, although I have a fondness for manuals, but that isn't the way that philosophy operates. It operates by introducing hypotheses, making distinctions, and moving towards desirable, good definitions, right? So what are some of those? We're still in chapter 1, and we discussed ends versus means, that there is such a thing as an end, and that he states that human life has an ultimate end. We experience various grades of ends and goals in our lives, but is there something which is desirable for its own sake? Is there something which makes life complete on its own without anything else? Is there something which is loved for, as I say, above it all else, and not as a means, and I always ask my students this too. We have a little discussion about happiness and why are they in the class, and well, of course to get a grade, and then of course because they love Dr. Erb, of course. But ultimately, they're taking their studies to whatever they're doing is for happiness, and then there's no more questioning after that. It's the ultimate end. So we talk about ends and means, and that and the various capabilities of the mind as thinking purely, that's speculative knowledge, mind as knowing in order to do, that's where ethics comes in, and then mind as making, and that's productive knowledge. Happiness concerns doing. It's something we do. It's not something we just accumulate, and that leads me to distinguish wants, need, and needs. And this is a typical distinction. You see it in the Greeks. You see it with Mortimer Adler. If we don't know what the true versus the apparent good is, we'll never get to what he calls happiness, eudaimonia, flourishing. We will be really as the arrow heading towards a target, but the arrow isn't being shot by anybody. It's freewheeling without aim. So we need to identify our target. The only way we can identify what happiness is by finding out what is our true good, what we need, the basic goods of human nature, versus what we may want here and now. Hic et nunc, as the medievals say. And the task of ethics is to align our wants to our true needs. This is part of the task at any rate. So happiness concerns a basic fulfillment of the basic needs of human nature. We have no choice about that. Choice concerns choosing the appropriate means to do that, but we all desire happiness by necessity. So where does Aristotle go with this? Just very quickly, the next section 4 in part 1, he talks about a function, and he talks about how happiness concerns our proper function, that which distinguishes us from lower species, and that's rationality and love, longing and knowing. And then eventually he describes moral virtue as the basic ordinary path to get there, because we need a perfection of our soul in order to fulfill our not only our rationality, but to perfect what is the arena of moral virtue? It's our passions and it's our actions. And these need perfected, guided, regulated, governed. And so he defines virtue as a characteristic in the soul involving choice. And then he introduces his notion of the mean or the middle way. It is a mean determined by reason, which a man of practical wisdom determines it. In other words, basically what he does is he identifies happiness as the ultimate end. He debunks pleasure, wealth, and honor as being insufficient. They're not final. They're not ultimate. They're not even sufficient. And then he isolates moral virtue. This is my part 5 in that chapter. He isolates moral virtue and then secondarily intellectual virtue as signposts along the way. We won't reach happiness, even this worldly happiness, without the moral virtues, without the perfections of our emotions and our appetites and our actions that occur through prudence, what he calls practical wisdom. So I give us kind of a general sense of that, and that moral virtue then is the signpost. Given all this, I don't go into much about contemplation, but ultimately he says a natural contemplation is the goal. Instead, I focus on friendship because I think it's more interesting to young people. And so that beautiful idea of friendship, which is so basic, really, to the Christian notion of charity, right? You can't have one without the other. And so Aristotle has a very broad idea of friendship, and he calls it reciprocal goodwill on one of 3 grounds: pleasure or utility or virtue. And that beautiful description he gives of virtuous friendship is very interesting. It stresses truth, that we want to live in the truth and affirm those who are living in the truth and be built up by them, pointed in the right direction. We're not perfect if we're virtuous friends, but we're all in via. We're on the way. And so his theory of virtuous friendship is beautiful. It puts pleasure in its place. We want to have pleasant friends, but pleasure is secondary. I think C.S. Lewis wrote about this as well. Pleasure depends on the activities that generate the pleasures. The pursuit of pleasure on its own, in the context of friendship or apart from it, makes no philosophical sense. What kind of pleasure? And so pleasure is parasitic. It's like a barnacle on a ship. The notion of free-floating pleasure as the goal of life would have made no sense to the Greek or the medieval, because pleasure is the bloom on the rose, something secondary that occurs when an action is performed well. But what's morally interesting and what's important for happiness is the actions, not the pleasures that they generate. So that's a little kind of excursus there I made in the book on friendship. And then finally, the very last part of the Aristotle section, I'll just say quickly, is I comment on this, quote, imperfect happiness. It's very elitist. It's essentially overly contemplative if you read it in terms of the end of the ethics. And there is no charity here. Friendship is an aristocratic exchange among equals. It is not the radical interdependence of wounded, and may I add, suffering human persons looking to the afterlife. So it's a limited ethic, but it does give you some philosophical tools.
It's a beginning. It gives you, yeah.
Yeah, I think, yes. And then we have Aquinas' ethics, and we have Pieper. I don't know if we have time for both, but is there anything you'd like to focus on more than anything else? I'll approach you.
Well, I love Aquinas, and I teach him, but if we have time for both, why not? So, I'd say to continue with Aquinas, and if we have time, we'll go on.
All right. Well, of course, St. Thomas, my patron saint, my favorite saint, and he takes it's a very complex chapter in some ways, because it's continually toggling back and forth between those Greek metaphysical principles and the Christianization of them. And so how does he Christianize it? Basically through the infused virtues, we know that. But let's just say here, I start out the same way. I try to trod similar ground. We start out with, I mentioned fides et ratio briefly, and then I go into happiness and the desire for an ultimate end in Thomas, and he takes that metaphysical structure, that he got from Aristotle, and he adds, adjure sequitur esse, a thing acts according to its nature. So the pursuit of happiness must correspond to our faculties. This is a faculty psychology and the human mind and will are our highest powers. And he goes beyond Aristotle in describing them as expansive powers. At various points in the Summa, he introduces the notion of levels of appetite, not just levels of soul, but levels of appetite, with the lowest being the plant and the highest being the human, because we're the lowest of the intellectual spirits and the highest of the animals. And so I do allude to this in the book, this notion of expansive powers. The higher one goes up on the ladder of being, the more scope, inclusivity, the more that Aristotle's axiom applies, namely the soul in a way, quoto modo, is all things. And so ultimately the soul is a participant in the inner life of God for him through the infused virtues. So you can see the building process that's going on there. He distinguishes human acts and what are called acts of man, which are relatively irrelevant actions. And under happiness, he deepens Aristotle's analysis yet again. He talks about everything being sought under the rubric of the good, and then he applies beautiful Greek distinctions to understand why those worldly goods that Aristotle talked about are inadequate. And he says and I'd like to just focus on one thing here, he talks about two goods in his section on identifying happiness. In Prima Secundae, question 2, I guess, he talks about two that are particular temptations for today. And one of them is power, and one of them is the human soul itself. If people can get beyond materialism and pleasure and wealth and even fame or honor, they might still be stuck saying, well, maybe happiness is power, and maybe happiness is the product of my own mind, my legacy, whatever I've produced, my intellectual acumen. And even these very high goods are not, they're all in potency to the universal good. He says only the divine good can lull the will. And that language of lulling and resting, the will resting, is very Augustinian. It's very beautiful. So he applies the act potency distinction to these very high goods and excludes them. He also tells us, and he reminds us, that the highest good is the last thing to be attained, and it's very difficult. The first thing we intend is the last in execution. And so I think he's counseling patience. And then he goes on to discuss, as I do, the perfect versus imperfect happiness, and how perfect happiness is an elevation of our nature and requires grace, and this kind of familiar language that most Christians are acquainted with to some degree. Mm-hmm. But the idea there is that happiness, we have this idea that happiness is not just I don't want to use the word, but a Pelagian kind of pull up your bootstraps and hopefully we'll hit on some luck and have Aristotle's, good birth and aristocratic privilege and everything else, and then we can exercise some moral virtues. That's just not the case for Thomas. The infused virtues, as you know, in some cases don't resemble the ordinary moral virtues very much. They relate us directly to God. And this whole moral life for Thomas is a response to God's special love for the rational creature. So only we are raised up, invited to participate in his inner life. And this elevation, which requires grace, is an invitation, and it requires a response. So there's a beautiful accountability here there and for him. Then I go through his idea of passions and friendship and, again, show how he deepens some of the Aristotelian ideas. And I basically pit his ideas of the emotions against the modern idea of the emotions, and what I call their, quote, untamed gods of the sovereign individual.
I like that.
They are. So they need to be regulated by reason and tempered by grace, freed and liberated. And he goes much deeper than Aristotle. He talks about the emotions that are lodged in the rational appetite versus the sensitive appetite. So he's expanding the whole picture of what needs governed and how. And then he affirms love as the foundational emotion is even foundational to hate. My students are always amazed at that. And that's near the end of that chapter, that love is so foundational even to the negative emotions. And that's a great insight for people to recognize that they're not, we are wounded, but these concupiscible appetites precede the irascible, and there's no us in that. So the last part of the chapter, I deal with friendship with God, this transformation by charity, really, of the human person into the inner life with God, and that's a beautiful, a very theological part of the book, showing that, and that all true virtue really requires charity. That's a mysterious thing, and I don't really get into it much in the book, but I would love to work on that more, that all virtue requires charity. He says that in the Secundae. So that the miser, for example, who exhibits the virtue of temperance for a while, or prudence or courage in crossing mountains or going through fire in order to avoid poverty, he says, these are not real virtues at all because they're not generated by charity. So one thing of the virtues, Augustine spoke about the Romans and how they're really just superb vices. So that'd be an interesting area to look at more deeply, but charity is the mother of all virtues, the form of all virtues. There's great mystery there. Yeah. At the end of that chapter, after I go through prudence and some of the virtues, I just discuss 3 ways in which Aquinas' ethics exceeds Aristotle. So, he speaks about participating in God's inner life. And then the way to reach that end is through grace. That's, again, Augustinian. And, you think of him in relation to Plato and the play to Nietzsche. We're not able to give him the willpower to reach his end. And then moral virtue. The one last point there is that I say moral virtue for Aquinas is not a mere instrument towards contemplation, as it seems to be for Aristotle. But rather, the moral virtues, even though we won't need them in the afterlife, they're intrinsic to our earthly happiness because of, the Christocentrism of his moral theology. The tragedies of life and the sufferings that we experience, these are transformed and yet somehow honored by God. And so there's a radicalization of the moral life and a kind of a new relationship of the human person to vulnerability and to tragedy and to suffering that would never be possible in the Greeks. And so that the wounds of Christ are even known and seen by the blessed in heaven. So you have their grace not destroying nature but fulfilling it, and this beautiful intersection of nature and grace in Thomas. So there's an element of mystery here. And yet it seems so true to our humanity. So that's the section on Thomas.
And that's a good section. And you have time, so if you want to go on, you certainly can.
You'd like me to talk about Pieper just for a couple of minutes?
Sure.
Okay.
I have time if you do.
Okay. Okay, I won't go into all the detail here, but Joseph Pieper is an amazing thinker because he is really a Thomist metaphysician and an ethicist, a moralist with an amazing life story of his own. And I think he assumes the Thomist metaphysics and theory of knowledge here, and he is juxtaposing them to the notion of leisure, false notions of leisure, which are the byproduct of false philosophies. So in that sense, he's dovetailed in with John Paul the Great in Fides et Ratio, and he makes not the same, but he makes a similar critique. So Pieper, however, focuses on culture in that book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, and he says culture is grounded on a proper concept of leisure, and leisure is guaranteed by what he calls free transcendent acts of man. And by that, he's referring to philosophy, the philosophical act, which begins in wonder and ends in truth, and worship. So you have this nice, connection between the transcendent acts, which build up a proper sense of leisure in the culture, and thus build culture. It's a beautiful kind of alignment there. So they both, John Paul the Great and Pieper, both critique modern culture. Why? They don't see, moderns don't see the world as creation or as gift. And so there is no proper response of gratitude and of celebration and of fidelity to the truth and, frankly, of refusing to despair. So it's Thomist realism and the notion of creation as gift, which we can establish even in philosophy, the notion of creation, that ground a proper sense of culture. So there's no proper response in the modern culture, Western culture. And so just as JP2 says, Pieper talks really about philosophy having a responsibility to form thought and culture. It is not a side game. It's not some academic game for certain people to wield authority over others or get tenure. Philosophy should be a public philosophy. Ultimately, it should be a way of life among the Christian believers. And so what I go through is a little bit of tracking the genealogy of what has happened in philosophy to that thwarted the proper development of leisure and culture through looking at Pieper's work. So in section 2 of the final chapter of my book, I begin by talking about the paradox of modernity. And the paradox is essentially that its idea of leisure as, what is it today, idleness, essentially, or entertainment. Leisure is formed how? It's formed through the idolization of work. It's workaholics that have invented this notion of leisure and the idolization of efficiency. So where did these ideas come from? Namely, life, one lives to work, and work should be mainly, its purpose is efficiency and external products as opposed to the perfection of the worker. It comes from Kant, Marx. And so I talk about what Pieper does with those philosophers and how they've misunderstood human nature and human knowledge. And particularly Kant's notion even of intellectual work, which one would think would be very noble, what it does is it forestalls any proper concept of contemplation, natural or supernatural. So Kant limits the mind's contact with reality to discursive activity. He cuts off the notion of a receptive contemplation, and thus of truth and the truths of morality. They become a matter of work too, such as duty, and the truths of religion are religious postulates. Nothing is really known. There's no certitude of faith. There's no receptive contemplation. Is demoted, and eventually it becomes servile. This is what we have today. Read Reinhard Hutter, for example, talking about the Polytechnic University, and the notion that philosophy and the liberal arts have been excised, and we have colleges devoted to the servile arts. That's not, of course, in Pieper. That's more recent. So what Pieper does then is try to rehabilitate the notion of contemplation. We know, Pieper doesn't say this, but I've written on it, and there are levels of contemplation, natural, which is acquired and philosophical. That's what we have in Aristotle. Supernatural, which is theological contemplation. And then mystical, which is experiential and through grace. So this is well-trodden ground. Pieper argues that this, even on the natural level of contemplation, the Greeks understood that the mind has not only an active role but a passive role, a silent perception of reality gained through intuition. He talks about the Greeks speaking of letting the mind rest its gaze on an object which is loved. This is wonder gives way to this into contemplation. For Plato, we see this, and we see it in Aristotle at the end of the Ethics. So he talks about that contemplation even in the natural order. And then on the he continues this in his work called The Philosophical Act. It's usually included with Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And he talks about the heart of worship actually beginning in the philosophical act. We have to transcend what he calls the workaday world vision of things, the utilitarian reductionism, and renew our wonder at the mystery of being. How do we do this? And by the way, what are the signs that this is afoot in our culture? He talks about philosophical wonder, and he says there are the philosophy. He refers to these transcendent acts. Okay, he talks about philosophy. He talks about the arts. Ultimately, he's concerned with worship, and he also talks about moments of existential shock, where we have, he says, proximity to death or a feeling of radical contingence and dependence. And these acts can displace us from our ordinary attitude, dislodge our ordinary utilitarian attitude, and they are not just negative, the way, people are panicking these days over what they're seeing in the media, but they're opportunities. They're opportunities where we can wake up to, gratitude that defines our humanity as a response to the divine gift of being. Why is there something rather than nothing, as opposed to the half-empty cup? So this beautiful imagery, in the book, I just want to mention one thing. I think it's page 94. I give this lengthy quote from Charles Péguy, this wonderful French writer, out of his book called L'Argent, Joseph of Nazareth, translated passage. Okay, and there he talks about the atelier, the artisan, the person who works at home. Many of us are working at home these days, and how we have the ability, the atelier, the craftsman, would make things for the sake of the work well done, as opposed to just for wages or utilitarian reason. And then Péguy translates this or contextualizes this in the whole life of the home, and where he says, quote, everything was raised. He's talking about the more pastoral agricultural life. He talks about the domestic ceremonial, the rhythm of hearth and handicraft from the first light of day. And he says everything would raise up the heart and mind. Everything was a day-long prayer. And he goes through the activities of the day, and the open door in the street, and the farmyard, and the threshold of the home. And Péguy makes this philosophical point, which I think our fellow there, people would agree with. As a result of this, what he calls domestic ceremonial and appreciation of things in themselves as opposed to just for their utility, this encourages the splendid derived sentiments of respect for all people, the elderly, parents, and family. So, even before he's discussing worship, we have here a transformation of culture through the domestic idea of work as prayer. Just beautiful. I think that Pieper and Péguy would be in agreement there. But the ultimate goal is to point to things such as gratitude, which is the proper human response to the gift of being, the philosophical insight, and that's in worship. So he talks about the proper virtue of worship as being gratitude, and I quote some things there regarding gratitude. To do with Bach and Mozart, and the reflection of things having a cause, effects having causes, and a celebration of that in their music. Drawing in some other instances there. There's also a section in there, I won't go on about it, but there's a section on inwardness and the notion of having a world, kind of a philosophical idea, that animals don't have inwardness, and their world is the extent of their physical contacts, really. But humans do have an interior universe, and we're able to see things not just as utilitarian problems as hurdles, but as mysteries to be entered into, and mysteries that we can't control. And even some of those philosophical questions about the nature of freedom and love are things that answers to which we don't just solve them. We enter into the infinite mystery of another person, for example. And there you have the beautiful back and forth antiphonal kind of dialectic between the intellect and the will. And the more we know, the more we love, and the more we love, the more we want to know. And this is, in a sense, a very natural gift to us of contemplation. It's the beginning, really, of contemplation of divine things on the human level. So that beautiful idea, I go over that, the human's spiritual inwardness. And then finally, Christian philosophy, and I just detail some of the problems there in modern philosophy. culminating in Nietzsche's Will to Power, where he says he doesn't know how to receive. I love this quote from Nietzsche. He says, "I do not know the happiness of those who receive. This is my poverty." And he's admitting, at least it's very honest, there's no sense of gratitude or contemplative joy there. So I go over different areas that intersect in Christian philosophy. I show how they intersect, the articles of faith, the preambles of faith, other philosophical and then common sense truths, and I show how they interrelate. So then I wind it up in the book. But essentially, I draw in different things and show the where this is all headed, towards a proper integration of faith and reason, and a proper integration of, rather, rehabilitation of culture through some of these sources. So it's an interesting book. It could have been longer, but so could the interview have. So what can you do, right?
Well, you could put out a second edition.
And then I would love to, seriously, I would love to feed in some of the great books material. There's so much that can be added and thought about, and I think Augustine is a missing figure here, because Augustine is so human and so psychological. The material, and then Plutarch's Lives and some of what Plato tells us, some of those exchanges in the Gorgias on power and on false happiness and on Socrates' views of otherworldly happiness and his confident joy as he faced his execution. There are so many historical texts and imagery that could really have made this fuller, but it is what it is. So I hope it's to the glory of God.
Oh, I think it is. And, again, you're dealing with very deep concepts, but you're doing it, in a way that's, I think, easy for, I guess I'd say, secular people, lay people, to understand. So that's a real gift. But I could see you easily expanding and writing a second edition, or maybe a different volume. So
a different part too, maybe Happiness in the Great Books or something like that.
I
deliberately kept it pretty, maybe even overly simple, Cynthia. I think people, a priest friend of mine said he's given it out to so many of his seminarians and so many people, lay people who are raising teenagers, people who need answers, but in a very simple, digestible, direct way. So there are those secondary reading, or not secondary, but the actual, the precise text in each of these thinkers that one should consult, or maybe an extra article or two. There's not a bibliography, but there's a little bit of there's a good glossary. So anybody who has any rudimentary Christian catechism, even if they're not Catholic, I think would find this very helpful. And particularly for young people, they need and want the philosophical answers. So it's a way of showing, where all this has gone, and Joseph Pieper is still carrying that torch, even though he's not with us. I think some more from Pieper would be great, too. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the book. And
well, I've enjoyed hearing about it. I think it's... Go ahead.
Yeah. One more thing I would add, though, is a section on Mary, because she, of course, is the summit of the contemplative, contemplating all these things in her heart. And I think St. Thomas would like me to add something on that. So.
That's a good idea.
More
but, I'm sure that you'll continue. You'll either expand that edition or you'll write another volume. But I think you've really produced something that's well worth producing.
Thanks. Thank you, Cynthia. Enjoyed talking to you. Great.
Same here.
Okay.
Okay. Would you like to close with a prayer?
Would you have a prayer to close with? I had one, but I might.
No, go ahead. You can.
I'll just pray this one, and this is very, very brief. And it is to Mary. Mary, I am all thine, my queen and my mother, and all I have is thine. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen.
Well, very nice to talk to you. I enjoyed the interview, and thank you for letting me interview you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.